and that the collective West is already beginning to use weapons with nuclear components.
Well, let's talk to Jonathan Katz, who's Director of Democracy Initiatives and a Senior Fellow with the German Marshall Fund. It's good to talk to you, Jonathan. Thanks for joining us from the context. Let's ask you, first of all, about this 12-point plan, about this peace proposal brought forward by China, lacking a little bit on detail, isn't it?
Yeah, it absolutely is. But interestingly enough, the first point in it is China saying that we must ensure territory and sovereignty for countries as point number one. And I think it was as pointed out today by one U.S. official who said, look, Russia today can pull its troops out of Ukraine, restore Ukraine's territorial integrity. So if China truly believes in its peace plan, that it would agree to its first point, which is to restore territory to Ukraine. And of course, it really doesn't want to do that. In fact, this trip is all about bolstering Mr. Putin, which China has given diplomatic cover to Mr. Putin over the last year of this war. They've also bought plenty of Russian energy to bolster Russia's economy, even while under sanctions. So China, this isn't a trip about peace. This isn't a trip about ending this war. This is about bolstering Mr. Putin, a war criminal who should not get this type of support from China.
And that has been said, hasn't it? It's been pointed out by analysts that actually China coming and saying, look, this is about us facilitating peace is a smokescreen. Fundamentally, this is about two countries bringing themselves closer together economically during a time when they are moving further away from the West.
It's just not even just about the economics of it. These are two autocratic leaders coming closer together. Since Mr. Xi came to power, Mr. Putin and Mr. Xi have met 39 times. So this is a personal relationship. It's two autocrats that bully their neighbors, that repress their own people. And so you can see where they see eye to eye. And I'm afraid Mr. Xi is going down the same path that Mr. Putin has, which has been consolidation of power, intimidation of neighbors, including Taiwan. So they have a lot to share beyond just economic relations or security relations. It's a personal relationship, but it's one about preservation of power, respectively, for both leaders.
Stay right there, Jonathan. I want to bring in another point of discussion here with you. There are concerns in the West that China's support for Russia, currently based on tech and trade, might become military. And today, we had a warning from the head of NATO, Jens Stoltenberg.
We haven't seen any proof that China is delivering lethal weapons to Russia. But we have seen some signs that this has been a request from Russia, and that this is an issue that is considered in Beijing or by the Chinese authorities. And therefore, our message has been that China should not provide lethal aid to Russia.
OK, well, a little bit to unpack there, because obviously when one's talking about pipelines and energy imports, things seem to be OK. But when you're thinking about military aid, that's when NATO and the West get really worried.
Yeah, certainly there's concern about the supply of Chinese weapons to Russia. Russia has seen their weapon supplies depleted over the last several months in this unprovoked war against Ukraine and Ukrainians. And of course, China and Russia have a long history of trade, military trade and weapons. And I think there's real concerns about China supplying ammunition, shells, drones. We're already seeing some drones connected to Chinese companies ending up on the front lines of the war. Being used by the Russians. So it's a real concern. And so when you hear U.S., Stoltenberg and others speak to this, I think what this can do is just escalate the conflict even further. And I think those warnings coming from the United States, coming from Europe and others are really critical right now to send a message to China that stepping over this line would be met with consequences, including sanctions.
And yet, if you're looking at it from a Chinese and Russian lens, they might argue that Ukraine's been getting weapons from the West for a while.
This is a war of aggression from Russia, an unprovoked, unjust war in which Russia is committing war crimes against the Ukrainian people. So right now, if China truly wants to be on the side of international law, They say they want to lead in terms of the UN and abide by the UN and these charters. The best thing that China can do right now is tell Russia to remove its troops from Ukraine and step back and truly be a partner for peace, which they aren't right now.
Let's bring in our panel now, Natalie and Leanne. And Natalie, looking at what's been happening, it's clear, isn't it, that China, although it obviously has a move away from certain Western countries, it still relies very heavily, doesn't it, on the EU in terms of economically and trade?
Yeah, well, I think Marianne, there are sort of two sides to the story, and I totally agree with Jonathan's analysis. But so on the peace question, so China's peace plan, I think the main point here is that most points on that plan are, fine. Well, perhaps not all, but some certainly are. Certainly the first one, reiterating, territorial integrity, sovereignty, independence of all countries, hence including Ukraine. The problem with that plan, of course, is that it says nothing about how to get there. And certainly China has been giving no signals whatsoever in terms of what it might be willing to do in order to ensure that Russia gets there, given that Russia is, as was being said, the actor that is violating these principles. But then on the one hand, there's a sort of total vacuity of this plan. But on the other hand, I think it's also worth highlighting the fact that, yes, indeed, this was all about the partnership between Russia and China. And yet, I think that in between the lines, it's also clear that there are limits to the no-limit partnership. I mean, some of the goodies that Russia was after, such as, for instance, announcing the Power of Siberia 2 pipeline, well, they're not quite there yet, yeah? So it's clear that China does indeed try and support Russia as much as possible, but it's also its first priority is ensuring that its economy gets back on track. And in order to do that, as you were suggesting, Marianne, it really cannot afford to completely, in a sense, and overtly hug in all possible ways Russia, because, of course, that would run the risk of not only incurring in secondary sanctions as far as the United States is concerned, but also severing its economic relationship with Europe, which it certainly cannot afford to do.
And Leanne, what do you make of what's going on here in terms of the US and where it might be looking towards China and those warnings and those potential for increasing sanctions in terms of companies that supply weapons and equipment to Russia?
Yeah, there's a couple of things here. The United States is obviously watching this very, very closely. There are the conversations about what to do immediately, and that includes perhaps additional sanctions. There's already been very heavy sanctions placed on not only Russia, but on companies that work with Russia. And so there's additional discussions around that. My colleagues at the Washington Post are reporting. But then there's the much bigger geopolitical question, too, that the United States is also watching very closely, and that is how this plays into what China does with Taiwan. And that is a huge concern of the United States. That is a threat that some in the United States and some government officials, and especially Republicans, fear is that is where China is moving next, using what Russia did in Ukraine for China to do to Taiwan. And so this is, a huge issue for the administration, and one not only now dealing with Russia, but also dealing with China, too.
OK, Natalie, thanks. Let me bring you back in at this point, Jonathan. Having heard what Leanne there and Natalie have had to say, do you agree with their assessments?
Yeah, I do. And of course, there's a number of other factors playing out. Taiwan is certainly of real concern for the administration, which has said that it would come to Taiwan's aid if they were attacked. And of course, China is certainly looking at what's taking place in Ukraine, learning lessons from the current situation, including sanctions, the issue of sanctions. The difference between Russia and China with the U.S. and sort of global economy is night and day. China is immersed in the global economy, is having economically challenging times. Mr. Xi is consolidated his power internally. And from my perspective, too, this looks a little bit like as we see Mr. Putin and Xi join together, real concerns about what will take place internally within China, ensuring that the economy remains strong. And so Mr. Xi has to really keep one eye on both the security situation, but really internally. And so playing around and with fire in terms of the global economy, its relationship with Europe and the United States is something that he certainly has to be concerned about. No doubt about that. And so it will be interesting to see what the final outcome of the conversations in Moscow really end up being about.
And interesting, isn't it, that Ukraine, President Zelensky inviting President Xi Jinping, Jonathan, to come to Ukraine, and that invitation hasn't had a reply yet. Not expecting one?
No, I'm expecting, look, China has had a relationship with Ukraine in the past. So there has been an economic relationship, Chinese investment in Ukraine, including in the agriculture industry. But the silence from Beijing when Zelensky is asking for these conversations speaks volumes. Again, if this is truly about peacemaking, then China is not putting its best foot forward when it comes to Ukraine. You have to talk to the Ukrainians. Russia is the aggressor here. Russia is the one that is violating international law. Mr. Putin is responsible for war crimes. Not only should he be just pulling troops out of Russia, be pulling troops out of Ukraine, but they should be sending Ukrainian children back home to Ukraine. So China has a lot that it can do to address these human rights challenges. And I think that they're clearly, even with Mr. Zelensky, not doing enough to reach out to the Ukrainians to be real partners in peace.
OK, well, Jonathan, good to talk to you and have you on the programme. As always, Jonathan Katz, thank you.
Thank you.